Now, when I was asked to speak here about the future of exhibitions, I thought it would be very important to begin with Edouard Glissant. I believe that the future is often invented with fragments from the past. And for me, Edouard Glissant, who was a friend and somebody who really was a mentor to me, is for me the most important thinker of the 21st century. I read him every morning. You know, Tarkovsky said that we need ritual for our age, and that in our time there are not enough rituals, so we need to invent rituals, and I have many. I buy a book every day. I'm really unhappy when I cannot buy a book every day, so that's a ritual. But the main ritual is really that I read every morning 15 minutes of Edouard Glissant when I wake up. So everything really I've done over the last 25 years and everything I'm going to do in the years to come is very, very deeply inspired by Edouard. There are still not enough translations. We did an exhibition with Assad Raza, which is now touring. It's in the Freedom Tower in Miami. We did this also with Gabriela Rangel and Rina Carval. It's basically an exhibition on Edouard Glissant and Lydia Cabrera, where we really want to make accessible the work of Glissant as a toolbox and show many artists who have been inspired by him. And I want to tell you today a little bit about why I believe that the future, in a way, is invented with Edouard Glissant. You have here a few drawings. He kept actually faxing and later on emailing me these drawings. Glissant was born in Martinique in 1928 and actually really called to global exchange, which would be not homogenizing. And I think that's what makes it so important today, because he already in the 70s started to actually explore the reality of globalization, and already in the 60s, I would say. And we can say that, of course, ideas like Creolization, archipelago, are concepts he worked with. I mean, here you see a drawing about the archipelago. Here another one. Here another one. What is fascinating is that Glissant's ideas are actually already all there in '58 when he writes La Lézarde, The Ripening. And it's a book which really considered the blend of languages and cultures as a decisive characteristic of the Antillean archipelago, which is what you see here. Glissant was from Martinique, and of course his native Creole was a combination of French and African languages, and actually it's something independent and unexpectedly new which came out of this combination, as Glissant shows. And it's interesting that on the basis of this, he later observed that there are similar cultural fusions all over the world. In the 80s, a period in which theory around globalization was developing in essay collections such as Le Discours Antillais. That's translated. You can read that in English, The Caribbean Discourse, selected essays. He expanded actually on the concept of creolization, applying it to the worldwide process of continual fusion. Here a quote from Glissant. He actually said, creolization is a process that never stops. And that's, of course, very much true, as I will show you later, for all my exhibitions. They are processes which never stop. Now the archipelago. We have the drawing here of the archipelago. I want to tell you more about the archipelic thought. The Antillean archipelago and its geography is important for Glissant because they are an island group that has no center, but consists of a string of different islands and cultures. The exchange that takes place between them allows each to preserve their own identity. And I have a quote here from one of my 11 recorded conversations with Glissant, which we are now going to turn in 2020 into a book. It's always been my big unrealized project to publish these conversations, and that's finally going to happen in 2020. We're going to publish these conversations with all these drawings. So in the conversation, Glissant told me the following. The American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. End of quote. And now comes the second quote, which really summarizes why this archipelic thought is so relevant for our time. Glissant writes or says, told me, I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And it is archipelagic thought that teaches us this. Now, Glissant wanted to apply this idea of the archipelago, the museum as an archipelago actually, to an art institution. What makes him so relevant for our field, the field of curating, the field of art, is that as a writer, his activities encompass not only literary and theoretical works, but also consistently this idea of production of reality. And that's, of course, what at the same time John Latham and Barbara Stevini did in England, when they founded the Art Displacement Group, and they say, we need to produce reality with art. We need to bring artists into society, not just in exhibitions. They said every corporation and every government should have an artist in residence, or even better than that, to have an artist on the board. And this idea of production of reality is something which Glissant did throughout his life. So, of course, he was a member initially of the resistances of, African independence. He was very close to Frantz Fanon. As a member of the resistance, he spoke in favor of Martinique's independence from France, and actually was banned for many, many years as a result. So he was a very political figure together with Frantz Fanon. He founded then in the 60s institutions. So as a writer, he became the founder of institutions. The idea that a poet, a philosopher, can actually start a school. He, in a similar way, like in art, we have the Black Mountain College. He founded the Institut Martiniquais d'études, a school that influenced an entire epoch of intellectuals. Patrick Chamoiseau, another great writer of Creolization, told me the other day when we worked with him that it's a really entire generation, actually several generations of people were formed through this institute Glissant built. And that's what makes him most interesting for us. He wanted to build a museum in Martinique. But these plans were never realized. This museum was not only a museum to contain the works which artist friends, like Wilfredo Lam or Roberto Matta would give him, but also was intended as a place, as Glissant told me, which would present the diversity of the art of both American continents. It was to span from the Mayas to the present. So a very, big time span of many thousand years. So the basic idea was that Glissant wanted to put together a historical and comparative encyclopedia of the arts of the Americas. So again, the archipelago, which you see in this drawing, served as a model. To quote Glissant, I imagine the museum as an archipelago. It is not the continent. It would accordingly have housed, as he said, not the synthesis, like many, as he always told me, many Western museums which want to be encyclopedic actually are a synthesis which serves to standardize. And he did not want that. He wanted to resist this standardization. He wanted it to be a network of interrelationships between various traditions and perspectives. So the museum as a network of interrelationships between various traditions and perspectives. So the museum would not illustrate previously established findings, but function as an active laboratory, which is exactly what my shows are about. They're never about, this idea of illustrating something we previously know, but they're a journey into the unknown. We go with artists on a journey, and basically they move through this laboratory. Or, to quote Glissant, it is not a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way, it's the quest for something we don't know yet, end of quote. And of course, this museum was never realized. Antonio Segui, the Argentinian painter who was very close to Glissant, told me that Glissant visited his studio with a whole delegation of politicians from Martinique, and they really considered to build it, but it was then for bureaucratic reason that it remained unrealized. And the last quote from Glissant, which again shows why this idea is so important. Glissant told me because in the end, the idea of a museum or art institution today is to bring the world into contact with the world, to bring some of the world's places into contact with other of the world's places. We must multiply the number of worlds inside museums, end of quote. And that very much is for me how curating a museum, should function in the 21st century. And it's particularly relevant, I think, that Glissant's museum is not yet realized. So I think part of the future, when I was asked to speak here about the future of art institutions, of curating, is of course that in the 20th century, we either built this, institute, he imagined, this institution, or that we transform existing museums into this idea of an archipelago, which is of course the second option, right? It's this idea of transformation. So I'm going to show you a few images. That was actually just from what I was talking about this morning, in my first lecture this morning in Singapore, and I didn't want to repeat too much, but I talked about the kitchen, and this idea that besides this idea of the laboratory, there has always also been this do-it-yourself spirit in my exhibitions. So I began in dialogue with Fischli Weiss at the very beginning of the 90s as a student to organize exhibitions. Christian Boltanski actually gave me the idea in my kitchen. So I transformed my kitchen into an exhibition space, my student kitchen. The exhibition had a budget of $200 and basically lasted for 3 months, and it had 27 or 28 visitors over 3 months, and it subsequently became a rumor. And what was very important was that the catalog was published. It was always very important. I never did anything without, publishing a book or a publication. Every exhibition has always been accompanied by a book. But to come back to the Glissantian idea of the laboratory, we sort of tried with Barbara, actually, van der Linden in '99 to apply that idea to a large-scale exhibition. So we were invited by the mayor of Antwerpen. They did an exhibition of Van Dyck, a historic exhibition, and they invited us to do a show where we could actually experiment. And so we did a show on the laboratory of the scientist and the studio of the artist. We wanted to do a show on experimentation. So here you see the Photography Museum in Antwerpen, some historic experiments like James Lee Byers World Question Center. There was also, Rosemary Trockel's sleep laboratory, where visitors were invited to sleep in the museum. And, we had about 100 laboratories of artists and scientists. And then, of course, the catalog was a laboratory. Bruce Mouch transformed his office to the museum, and every day the catalog was designed as an evolutive book. It ended up being a book of 3,000 pages, but it was like a wall newspaper also. So many different laboratories. We had open lab days in the cities, because I suppose it's the same in Singapore. We never really know where in a city the scientific laboratories are, and also we don't really have access to them. So the idea was that visitors could not only visit artist studios and see a laboratory exhibition, but they could also go to the scientists' laboratories. Cities on the Move was the first time I came to Singapore. It was a show Huan Ru and I did. It's missing here that it actually started in the Secession in '97 in Vienna for the centenary show, and then toured through all these museums. And we very much applied, Glissant's idea to this exhibition. Here you see images of the Hayward Show, which Rem Koolhaas and Ole Sharon designed. We invited for each show a different architect to design it. Shigeru Ban did Helsinki. Chang Yung-ho, together with the late Huang Yongping, did the Secession, and I want to remember Huang Yongping here, who very sadly passed away last year, the visionary Chinese artist, who was my neighbor, and was really, none of this would ever have happened without him, because he was really the artist from whom I learned everything about Chinese art, through whom I then also basically started to find the curiosity which made me do this show with Huan Ru. And we wanted to do a show on Asian cities without actually, again, going back to Glissant, you see, so it wasn't the idea of illustrating a previously established finding, but we wanted to make an active laboratory. That means we wanted to build a city. And so together with all the artists, we built a city, and it involved an urban mini-golf course by Sa Kwok Siang. It involved the Flying Angels of Harry Dono, who were always with us. They were like our, how would you call this in English? Protective spirits. They accompanied Harry's angels, were the protective spirits of Cities on the Move, and accompanied us wherever the show went. And then also, of course, what we learned from Glissant, here you have, for example, Surazi Kuzolwang collaborating with the architect Cedric Price on market stalls, in London. So the exhibition included a city would have a market. So there was a market, a real functioning market, where you could buy things for £1. And the idea was also, what we took from Glissant, is that the show would change from city to city, you see, because we felt, and I think the reason why Glissant is so important, it's difficult to sort of summarize it, but if I have to summarize it in one sort of paragraph, we can say that, in a way, we live in an age of globalization. And this is not the first time the world experiences globalization. The Roman Empire was a moment of globalization. There have been moments of globalization in different parts of the world, in the East, in the West, in the North, in the South, throughout history. However, this is the most extreme form of globalization the world has ever experienced. Through technology, we can even say it's the most violent form of globalization the world has ever experienced. So Glissant early on understood that these homogenizing forces of globalization risk to erode differences, that they will bring differences to disappear. You know, at the same time, he also understood that there will be a counter-reaction to globalization, and that counter-reaction will lead to new localisms, new forms of nationalism, in the worst case even new forms of racism, and he said we need to resist this as well. And that's of course something which was very premonitory, you know, because he said that already in the 70s, 80s, and it is something we can now see all over the world. We can see the devastating effects of the homogenizing globalization. Extinction, not only the ecological disaster, the extinction of species, but also extinction of cultural phenomena. Languages disappear, many cultural phenomena disappear. And at the same time, we can see globally this counter-reaction. And Glissant said we need to resist both. And we need to come up with a new idea, which is Mondialité. In English, you could call it Mondiality. And that would be a global dialogue which produces and enhances differences. And in this sense, listens also. It's the quality also of listening to a place. So obviously, in the art world, by the 90s, when we did this show, globalization had arrived and things started to be shipped around the world. So we said no to shipping. We said there is only very few things which are shipped. So it is also to do with ecology. And we said most of the things are locally, sourced. And also we would each time listen to the city where the show went, and we would establish a connection between the Asian cities and, Copenhagen and London and, New York, wherever the show went, because it went to many destinations in Europe and the United States. And so the idea was that in a very Glissantian way, the exhibition became this evolving, laboratory. And at the end of the tour, it went to Bangkok after 4 years on the road. And in Bangkok, there wasn't really an institution. There wasn't a museum of contemporary art which could host the show, but there was a desire to do the show. So we did it just all over the city. It became a form of urbanism, which is anyway something I've always been very interested in, how we can actually make curating a form of urbanism. Another show where we applied the Glissantian idea of, the show, as he says, not being a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way, but the quest for something we don't know yet is Utopia Station, which we did with Rick Ritt and with Molly. So it was an artist, Rick Ritt, an art historian and scholar, Molly Nesbitt, and a contemporary art curator myself, co-curate an exhibition on Utopia. But it wasn't on Utopia, it was on Utopia Station. And again, Glissant was the big inspiration, because basically he was in a way, the godfather of the show. And he criticized the classical utopias, such as Plato's Republic and Thomas More's Utopia, for being conceived as static systems. He wanted there to be a new, more alternative form of utopia, consisting of a continuous dialogue, which is exactly what we wanted this show to be. We did not want it to be a static utopia, a la Thomas More. We wanted it to be very sort of evolutive, changing, etc., etc. We were also inspired by Ernst Bloch, who, when pushed against the wall by Adorno to finally say what is utopia, said, something is missing. And of course, Glissant referred to utopia as quivering or trembling because it transcends established systems of thoughts and subjects itself to the unknown. To quote Glissant, it must be said from the start that trembling is not uncertainty and it's not fear. Trembling thought, and in my opinion, every utopia passes through that kind of thought, is first of all the instinctive feeling that we must reject all categories of fixed thought and all categories of imperial thought. So these are the two key things of his trembling utopia notion. Rejecting all categories of fixed thought and imperial thought. The all world trembles. The all world, and in French, it's very beautiful because all world is tout monde, right? It's the institute of tout monde. He always used this notion of tout monde. The all world trembles physically, it trembles geologically, it trembles mentally, spiritually, because the all world is looking for the point, not the station, but the utopian point where all the world's cultures, all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another dispersing or losing themselves. And there cannot really be a better definition of what we need in the current world, I would say, no? That we can find a station where we have a point, an utopian point, where all the cultures can actually hear each other and, you know, not lose themselves, but somehow be in a dialogue. And that's what, for him, Utopia was, a reality where one can meet with the other without losing oneself. And that's the exhibition we did. You know, Rickrit built a station. We had this whole evolutive poster project. It would go far beyond the time frame here to go into detail, because I actually promised Focus that this will not be a marathon, because sometimes we organize 24-hour talks, but I promise that we will somehow end it after maybe an hour or an hour and a half. So certain things will need to be shortened. So in any case, you know, Rickrit built this station. It happened inside and outside. We had the Oleana project of Marcel Roslan. We had the Church of Fear of Christoph Schlingensief. The posters, you know, where you can find all these posters on eFlux. And the idea also that we would invite, you know, unexpected participants. I've always been very interested in this idea of unexpected curatorship and unexpected, you know, invitations to exhibitions. So we would have Bruno Latour, the philosopher and historian of science, curate tabletop experiments for Laboratorium. And Bruno said we were crazy to invite him to curate. He says, you know, I'm a philosopher, historian of science, I'm not a curator. So we convinced him, we said, you know, we really need him in Laboratorium. So he curated a series of tabletop experiments where experiments were basically done in public. And he enjoyed it so much that he went on, you know, as a, you know, public intellectual to actually curate 3 shows at ZKM, and he will also curate the next Taipei Biennial with his colleague Martin. So, you know, this idea that you bring people from outside the art world into the art world can be very, very productive. At the same time, you bring practitioners from outside the contemporary art world, like Agnes Varda, the eminent, you know, late Agnes Varda, the filmmaker. Her whole life was basically showing her work in film festivals. And she's one of the most influential, you know, pioneers of the Nouvelle Vague, of many things. And she basically was so excited to come to Venice because she says, I was never in a contemporary art show. So she could do something in our show she could never do in a film festival. So she disguised herself as a potato, and she came to Venice and launched the Patat Utopia, you know, project. Then, of course, Do It is another project which was deeply, you know, influenced by Glissant, the idea of a global exhibition. It has happened in more than 160 cities so far. All these artists are sending us instructions, and these instructions then can be realized. And in each city where it happens, we add new instructions. So, you know, also this idea that you basically send a touring show to a city and don't change it, it's just unbelievably arrogant. It's very important to each time make a local research and bring local artists on board. So the beauty of this is that we have now more than 1,000 instructions from all continents, and we can really see through the project that instruction art is not only a thing of conceptual art and fluxus in the West, you know, that you have basically on all continents a very interesting history of artists writing recipes, writing instructions, writing how-to manuals. And I mean, we have many do-it versions in Asia, many do-it versions in Latin America. There are more than 80, you know, in the US. Several also in Africa, and of course there are all the ones we don't know because people just do it without telling us, you see, because it's open source. It's really open source. Everybody can somehow just do it. We do ask people to send us images because it's important for the archive, but people can literally just do it. So that's an example of an application of Edouard Glissant's idea on a very daily basis. Now this is for everyone, is of course the motto. Glissant was always telling me that we need generosity. And I think it's very important for the 21st century. And I always thought that I wanted generosity to be my medium in a way. And I wanted, you know, to do exhibitions which are extremely generous, which are for everyone. And of course, the baseline of this, you know, the bottom line of this would be, you know, free admission in museums. Or here is Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web. He invented in 1989, 31 years ago, the World Wide Web. It was March 89. And then he did for the Serpentine, he did for us a map of how he actually sees the World Wide Web today. So that's a web, that's a map drawn by the inventor of the World Wide Web, you know, 27, he did it about 3 years ago, so 27 years after his invention. Now, Tim Berners-Lee says, and we discussed this morning, that actually, the World Wide Web's net neutrality is endangered, because we soon will have a World Wide Web where you have an internet which is fast for people who pay and which is not fast for people who don't pay. And that's against the idea of Tim Berners-Lee. So he says this is for everyone. We need the same fast World Wide Web for everyone. And in a way, analog to institutions, this of course means several things. This means that first of all, we need to have in institutions, in museums, free admission. We deeply believe at the Serpentine in free admission for more than 1.2 million visitors a year, because in a society of exacerbated inequality, we feel that everybody should have access to art. But more than that, I believe that we need to go outside the museum with our exhibitions and projects towards the people. Because even if you have free admission, you still have the door. And the door is a threshold. And you still have many people in society who actually believe that museums are not for them. And I'm always telling this example that the other days I was stopped by someone who in front of the Serpentine who asked me if I would work there, and then I said yes, and he wanted to tell me the story of his daughter. And they basically, he and his daughter came to the park, and all of a sudden the daughter ran into our pavilions, because we are building we're building every summer a pavilion in front of the Serpentine. There are no doors, right? So everybody can just come in. And he wanted to tell us a story that his daughter had run into the pavilion and had an epiphany and now wants to become an architect. So he wanted to thank us. But the second part of the story is more important, because I then asked him, if they had visited the exhibition. And he said they didn't. And I said, why? And then there was a very long silence. And then he said, because he doesn't believe that exhibitions and museums are for people like him. So you see, if we would not have gone with the pavilion towards them, his daughter would never have had this epiphany. And that means, we need to more and more go not only with pavilions, but also with exhibitions outside the museum. We need to go into the public space and also into different neighborhoods. We are now working with the borough of Barking-Dagenham in London with the Serpentine, which is one of the boroughs with the highest unemployment rate in the UK. And we are bringing artists, like we're having Susan Lacey there in residence. The great artist Susan Lacey is spending time there, and we have several artists producing ballads, radio ballads. So, we're taking this very seriously, that we basically try to have not doors and go beyond doors. And the pavilions happen every summer. It began with Zaha Hadid. Everything started with Zaha Hadid, who was the late Zaha Hadid, who was our other mentor. And then she started with Julia Peyton-Johnson's pavilion. The first one I was involved was Rem Koolhaas, we commissioned in 2006. Then Olafur Elias and Cecil Baumann-Kettil-Thorsen, Frank Gehry, Sana, and then Jean Nouvel, and then Peter Zumthor. It became a more monastic pavilion, then Herzog de Meuron, Ai Weiwei, and then we went into a younger generation, right? With Sue Fujimoto, Smiljan Radic, Selga Scano, Bjarke Ingels, more recently Francis Queré. The youngest architect in the series is the young Mexican architect Frida Escobedo. And then last year, very recently, just came down Yunya Ishigami, who created this, there's a soundtrack to this talk. Anyway, Yoko Ono always told me every exhibition should have a soundtrack, so maybe lectures as well. So here, this pavilion, seems to be very light and weightless, but it's actually tons of, of slate. And these pavilions are also sites for performances. So, Rem Koolhaas always said a pavilion without content is meaningless shape. So we basically use these pavilions also to do events. We hand them over to artists. So young artists can do performances, concerts. For example, Telfar did a fashion show last summer, so they can become a place for fashion. Or a play. Here you have the young artist Precious Okoyomon, who created an extraordinary play within the pavilion using, Yunya Ishigami's pavilion like a mini theater, right? And then the week after, it became a site for a concert, then it became a film screening. So it's a kind of a content machine. And of course, it's not only us who invent use, but also visitors during the day find all kinds of unexpected use of these pavilions, like joggers are using it, and so on and so on. The marathons are our discursive platform where we every year invite 50, 60, 70 artists to talk about one topic, scientists, architects, and these are the themes. So we've started with interviews, Portrait of London, experiments, manifestos, and more recently the themes have been more focused on technology with AI, with the guest ghost host machine, and the work marathon, the repercussions of AI. Here you see, for example, Doris Lessing, when Rem Koolhaas and I interviewed her. So this produces a lot of archive, but it also produces, because the other thing which I think is very relevant, which Glissant said, is that we basically need to go beyond borderlines of disciplines. And this idea, it was already conceived by Alexander Dorner in Hanover in the early 20th century, that if we want to understand the forces which are effective in visual arts, we need to connect to science, to music, to literature, to architecture, all these disciplines. And it's always very, difficult when as an institution you organize, for example, an architecture talk, then the architecture world shows up, and almost no one from the art world. And then you organize an art talk, and then the art world shows up, and no one from the science world. And I always found that very depressing. So that's why we wanted to come up with a format, because I firmly believe that if we want to change the world, and if we want to address the big topics, challenges, dangers of the 21st century, we need to go beyond the silos. The world is still too segregated in these silos. And even within cities, people don't meet between the disciplines. So because here we have always a theme, and then, for example, here we had AI, here you see James Bridle, we had AI, but we had visual artists, architects, scientists, programmers, AI experts, politicians, all kinds of disciplines talk about AI. Somebody would come to listen to a poet and would then listen to an AI expert. So in a way, it creates this mix of disciplines through the format. And for us, it's a sketch, in a way, how society should work. It's a model which we see every year. Here you see Hito Steil. And as I said, little by little, we started to go into this idea of experiments also with technology. We felt, McLuhan has noted the ability of art to anticipate the future. In the foreword to his book, Understanding Media, he calls art an early alarm system, which is pointing us to new developments in times ahead. He says art as a radar environment takes on the function of indispensable perceptual training. And that's, of course, also what James Bridle talked about in his talks. And it's interesting that the Namjoon Paeks of our time, because of course Namjoon Paik started early in the 60s to work with robots and use these technologies that would subsequently influence society. And I think the Paeks of our time are working with the internet. They're working with digital images, with AI, with AR, and they use again these technologies as a kind of an early alarm system. And of course, they use them in terms of possibilities, but also to critically assess, as McLuhan says, the dangers. So for example, Hito says, it's not only AI, it's also AS. You have artificial intelligence, and then you have artificial stupidity of all the bots, right? And then, of course, another thing is the potential disappearance of work through AI, and that became the topic of the work marathon, which we did with Bernard Stiegler. And the idea, again, I mentioned before with Artist Placement Group, that one sort of tries to produce reality. So for example, here we did a marathon with Bernard Stiegler and many, many artists and architects and scientists about the future of work. And Stiegler talked about this idea of, a intermittent, not a basic general income, but an intermittent general income. And we analyzed, what impact will AI have on the work of the future. And a whole manifesto came out of that, related also to ecology, which was now submitted by Stiegler and us last week, actually, in Geneva, to several international organizations. So the idea to enter and hear some of these debates where you have, for example, a social sculptor, John Gray, a painter, Lynette Adumbake, and David Adje, the architect, discuss the future of work. And you can see all of these discussions on our website. New experiments in art and technology meant also that we, of course, needed a chief technology officer, because usually museums don't have a chief technology officer. Now, we thought, actually, if we think about the idea of John Latham and Barbara Stevini, and that we proclaim always, I really do believe that every city and every corporation must have an artist on the board or in residence, we, of course, need to take that ourselves seriously. So with Ben Vickers, we appointed an artist to be our chief technology officer. And that immediately triggered all kinds of, new projects. I'm just going to show you a few of the most recent ones. Suzanne Treister, whom you see here, a pioneer working actually with technology, developed this piece From Survivor to the Escapist. So it comprised an artist book, but also a research into AI, cosmology, theoretical physics, which brought together a cosmic trip through a potential future of humanity and the universe. And that was also channeled in a mobile web app, which you can download from the Serpentine, The Escapist, a black hole space-time, which actually allows you to enter Tristar's work through a ring of augmented reality portals in the sky. By pointing their mobile device camera at these sky-based portals, so visitors could be in Kensington Garden and make these, cosmic experience in the park. So that was one digital commission. Another one very recently was Jenna Sutela. The piece is called I Magma. It's a machine oracle dreaming our collective futures. It's the latest, basically, of these commissions we are doing. A psychedelic technology is an app through which a machine oracle delivers daily divinations. So people can get daily divinations at the Serpentine, born out of a growing network of users. So the work consisted of different elements, an app for mobile devices, and a community of head-shaped lava lamps, which actually were on display both at the Serpentine and also at the Moderna Museet. Now, obviously, these new experiments in art and technology also means new alliances. It means all kinds of collaborations, where with the Serpentine, work with other museums, but also we work, of course, with tech partners, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Here you have Jenna Sutela. Again, you can download it. And then the most recent project is actually Catharsis by Jakub Kurt-Steensen, a project which we literally launched 3 days ago, and it's a collaboration with BTS, the Korean K-pop band. And that, of course, is another thing which we believe a lot in. I believe a lot that, if you think about what I mentioned with the marathon, you have these different bubbles in the world. You have these spheres. You have the art world, you have the literature world, you have science. At the same time, you have the world of pop. And it's bringing all these different spheres together. So here you have basically the world of art meeting the world of K-pop. And that's an incredibly interesting crossing. And we were very fascinating. The Korean curator, actually, who invented this project is Dae-Young Lee, who before actually worked with technology at Hyundai and now is independent, and contacted BTS and actually suggested to them that that's really interesting in terms of the 21st century, that there is an alliance between institutions. So he contacted the Serpentine, the Gropiusbau in Berlin, institutions in Argentina, in New York. Thomas Saraceno does something in Argentina. And we immediately connected to Jakub Kurt-Steensen because we realized that BTS have a big interest in sci-fi, Ursula Le Guin, they have an interest in psychology. Jung is often quoted. The red book of Jung is always in my office. It's a daily inspiration. And we knew that Jakub Kurt-Steensen was very interested in these same ideas, the Danish artist and game inventor. So we invited him, who had already designed our augmented reality pavilion, because in addition to these physical pavilions, we now have AR pavilions in the park. So now for this project, he developed Catharsis, which is basically, and here is he and I and the whole group in conversation with BTS a couple of days ago. And here is Catharsis. So it's basically a digital simulation of a very old forest that has developed undisturbed over many hundreds of years, and is basically based on fieldwork with Matt McCorkle. So it's a mapping of a virtual ecosystem, and it's a work which has a lot to do with extinction. It's a single continuous shot that moves from the watery underground roots to the surveying viewpoint of the canopy. So in a way, it's also slow media, because it helps us to focus on the natural world and create new narratives about our ecological future. And it was fascinating because the nanosecond we started that, and I would say about 20 minutes after it went viral online, we had a completely different public at the Serpentine. Hundreds of people who had never visited the gallery before. And I really believe, in the future, in many more such crossovers or crossings to happen. Then, of course, we started to think, how could we bring these digital experiments also into the field of exhibitions, right? And so Zaha Hadid was a very close friend of mine. She was a trustee. She was at the very origin of our architecture work. She gave us our mantra: there should be no end to experimentation, which we say every morning when we come to the office, to remember, to not forget that. And I met Zaha, or saw Zaha actually, maybe a week before she so very tragically passed away. And she had mentioned in a lecture that she had done these sketches and drawings and doodles, and that they would be in her apartment, under her bed and in a cupboard, and that no one had ever seen them, and she never brought them to the office, and it was kind of the reservoir of her ideas and of her unrealized projects. And so I obviously got like super excited, and I said we must do an exhibition. And we then, of course, did it as a posthumous homage, because so very tragically she could no longer collaborate on it. But it was really very important for us to honor her through this show. And we digitized, many of these notebooks. And we also remembered actually that Zaha had always told us that she could imagine to actually have more dimensions, because her architecture is very multidimensional, to have even more dimension if this work would go into VR. So we worked with Google Cultural Institute on a VR commission and brought it for the first time into the exhibition. So that the commission would no longer just be on the website, would be coming to the show. But it still was, of course, separated because you needed the goggle. And that's why we then wanted to go further. And with Ian Cheng, we wanted to show his simulations. That's, I think, very fascinating, because here you have a situation where you no longer have a loop. It liberates, because with moving image, we were always stuck with the loop. At a certain moment, it starts again. But with these simulations, as long as there is electricity, these works will continue to grow, to evolve. They're like living systems, right? And so, in addition to these simulations, we invited Ian to basically do Bob. And Bob is the first time that we had a work with a central nervous system in the gallery. Bob stands for bag of belief. It's this creature. It's not smart. It's sentient. And unlike these simulations you saw before, it's actually aware of you as a viewer. It is aware of you and can interact with you, and you might in turn influence its emotional life. So in this sense, Bob can be moody. Bob can be, Bob can also ignore the viewer if Bob is in a weird mood. And and one day Bob woke up at 3 a.m. and the gallery, opened at 3 a.m. instead of 10 a.m. So that was our first experience with the AI creature. It continued with Pierre Wieg, with Umwelt. Here it became very clear that art can also have the function of making the invisible visible. I'm from Switzerland, that, growing up there, the first artist I kind of came across was Paul Klee. And I've always been very obsessed by the little drawings by Paul Klee. And I read as a student that Paul Klee said that art makes the invisible visible. And I think it's very, we are every day with these devices surrounded by algorithms we don't see and don't understand. And so I think one other important function of art at this moment in time can be, in the Paul Klee sense, to make the invisible visible in relation to these technologies. Then with Sandra Perry, a whole other experiment in art and technology, basically with avatars, but also, very importantly, using technology as basically a tool of resistance against surveillance and against repression. Of course, also, the whole exhibition of hers was, open source, new ways also of displaying the work. And more recently then, the work with S.E.A, who just opened a show here in Singapore with her boat. That will be our next exhibition, so I'd like to invite you all to come and visit it. It will be in spring in London, and we'll then go on a tour, so I hope you can see it in one of the cities. It will continue to evolve. It's a large-scale institutional show, the first one of S.E.A in London, called Blueprint. And it's an exhibition which has a lot to do, actually, also with a protest against forgetting, because I think we should never forget that memory is very important in this digital age. And we have more and more information, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have more memory. Amnesia is somewhere maybe at the core of this digital age. So S.E.A investigates the whole history, really, of the arrival of the internet in China, which is a very different history from the history in the West, and has a lot to do also with Russia. And the interesting thing is that this is mostly now obliterated. The traces disappear. So if you think, for example, in the 60s, the Bechers, two photographers from Düsseldorf, documented all the amazing architecture of industrial architecture in the Ruhrgebiet. Today, we would have no images. It's all gone now. It disappeared. Without the Bechers, we would have no images of this architecture. In a similar way, without S.E.A, we would probably have no traces of this extraordinary history a memory of the places, where the internet arrived in China. So I think what she does actually to the digital age in China is kind of similar to what the Bechers did to the industrial age in the Ruhrgebiet. And of course, she doesn't use photography; she uses newer forms of technology. And interesting is also that actually S.E.A in collaboration, and again it's a partnership here, it's with Acute, with Daniel Birnbaum and Jacob de Geer, we will develop an augmented reality and virtual reality kitchen in the exhibition. So it goes back to my beginnings, you see, with the kitchen show, but this time it will be a VR and AR kitchen. And I mentioned the protest against forgetting. One thing which is very important in the research is that we not look only into where art goes, but that we also look back. When I was a teenager, I started to visit a lot of artists, and everything I did subsequently was kind of inspired or taught to me really by artists. So Alighiero Boetti, for example, would say you should look into unrealized projects, right? And so I would start to ask artists about the unrealized project. Or Rosemarie Trockel would say, when I visited her, she was then in her 30s, she would say, I really feel that it's urgent that we go to every city and ask, who is the pioneering artist who is not recognized? Because there's so many, because it was the moment when Louis Bourgeois started to get recognition. Right? And it's kind of incredible to imagine that in '87, Louis Bourgeois just started to have her first museum shows in Europe. And Rosemarie was kind of saying, there are many more artists who deserve that recognition, mainly women artists who haven't had the visibility, and artists in all geographies. So she said you should just go from city to city and say who are the pioneers and interview them, do exhibitions, do books, which is what I've done ever since. So a recent example, there are about 4,000 hours now in my archive, so that would be another lecture, to tell you about this whole archive. But a recent example is basically Lucita Hurtado. So I was in LA and speaking to Bettina Korek and Kevin McGarry, and I said, is there a Louis Bourgeois type of figure in LA? And they told me that there just had been an exhibition of Lucita Hurtado, who is 99 years old, who has painted for more than 70 years, was with Wolfgang Pahl and related to surrealism in Mexico, friends with Frida Kahlo, friends with Duchamp, very closely related to the Mexican painter Tamayo, then moved to the West Coast, part of the Matthion generation, never part of the movement, as an artist completely independent, involved in early feminism, in the early environmental movement. Here you see a reconstruction of her show in the Women's House in LA, which she did in the 60s. And so we immediately decided to do her first ever museum show at the Serpentine, which will now tour in spring to LACMA. And we're going to bring it to the different cities of her life. Because obviously she's lived in LA, and we hope that it can then tour to Mexico, to the Tamayo Museum, her friend Tamayo, and to the different cities where she had been. Another thing, of course, which in a way we can say is that, many of the exhibitions I showed you have to do with new formats, but they still have somehow to do with space. They even if they happen in unexpected spaces like the kitchen, or use space in an unexpected way, they still have to do with space. And my unrealized project, because when I started to always ask artists about unrealized projects, artists sort of would answer me, I started to be myself more and more ask, what is my unrealized project? And so I started to make a list of my unrealized exhibition. And one was actually to do an opera. I always wanted to do a big group show where we would give the artists time and not space. So we would go to the artist and we would say, we want to invite you to have 15 minutes. And then, the combination of these 15 minutes would become an opera. So we would have a composer who would work with the artist, and it would be an opera as a group show. Now again, we're in this idea, that everything is in boxes. So we went to see all the opera directors in the world. We didn't go and see them, but we called them and wrote to them. And they all said, we are not a museum. This is a contemporary art show. But we couldn't do it in a museum because we needed an opera house, or a big theater. So the only one who somehow understood it was the legendary Gérard Mortier, who passed away. He was a very visionary opera impresario. But he said, if only I would still be in Brussels, we could do it. But in the meantime, he was in big operas. He was in Paris at Opéra Bastille and Garnier, and then in Madrid. And he said the bureaucracy, we could never make it happen. It wouldn't work. So then a new festival started in Manchester with Alex Poots, instigated by Peter Saville, who actually, was the you see, Manchester did what Latham said and Stevini said everybody should do. Manchester appointed an artist to be their creative director. And every city should have an artist, on their side to be the creative director. So Saville said you should do a festival. And, Peter Saville was the right person to do that because he's so interdisciplinary. He not only told them that they should hire Alex Putz, but he also told them that they should do a festival with many different disciplines where projects can happen which cannot happen elsewhere. So it was exactly where our opera took place. And it then went to Basel, where again it was a combination of the theater in Basel, Art Basel, the fair, and the Baylor Foundation as a museum, which made this project happen. And a few examples. Philippe Pareno, the ventriloquist, was the sort of inaugural act, which led to the piano of Liam Gillick, to Olafur Eliason's mirroring, to Rickritz and Arthur's Sonic, 15 minutes, to Kouchonga's Trembling Tree, where the smell of a forest was, in the audience. It appealed to all the senses. And it then, led also to Henri Sala's Butterflies. It led to Tacita Dean's Silence, so there had to be, of course, John Cage's Silence, performed by Merce Cunningham, was one of the last projects of Merce Cunningham, and then it concluded in Dominique Gonzalez Förster, and little by little all the orchestra would leave the stage until you would have only one violinist left, and in the middle of it you had the Rat and the Bear of Fischli Weiss, the whole thing also had, of course, an opera within the opera, because Matthew Barney was actually the artist who had most experience with opera. So his thing was an opera, so it was not 50 minutes, but it was 50 minutes. And so, you had like a Matthew Barney opera within it. And then we continued with the festival to do lots of experiments, like for example here, many shows we could not do in a museum. For example, an experimental exhibition on literature, which was again an homage to Glissant, with many different novelists who would be on stage with their interpreters here in the Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And then, last but not least, the current moment. I wanted to when I was asked to do this talk, to also give a little bit about an outlook, what is urgent. And I think in this current moment of ecological danger, we should remember, the artist Gustav Metzger. I began kind of with Edouard Glissant, mentioned also Etel Adnan, who was, of course, always a great inspiration. And another mentor is Metzger. He never stopped insisting that artists should create works which address the urgent danger that society faces. Specifically, he called upon artists to use their agency to get people to wake up facing the threat of extinction. As he put it in 2014 at the opening of the exhibition Facing Extinction, we have the present time a destruction taking place in and of nature unprecedented in history. Metzger argued that the world of art, architecture and design need to stand against the ongoing erasure of species and cultural phenomena, and he said it's our privilege and our duty to be at the forefront of these struggles. And this is why we decided at the moment when the Serpentine turns 50, in 2020, not to look back, but to look to the next 50 years, from 2020 to 2070, and basically facing the ecological catastrophe to establish kind of a project where artists, designers, architects from across the world would create works that respond to the climate emergency. But it would also be a project which would not be an event, which would not be an exhibition. So it has also to do with slow programming. I think we should develop projects on which we work for 10 years, for 20 years. We should go beyond this, very wasteful idea of permanently creating events. A much more long durational horizon, a little bit like with Do It, which evolved. There's never been a transport involved with Do It. You can just basically download the instruction, but there has been an ongoing dialogue. And so in a similar way, we are thinking with this project to have these 50 campaigns. The artists are going to be invited to do campaigns. And one of our goals in the face of ecological catastrophe will be to sort of search for ecological intelligence rooted in imagination, in empathy, in attentiveness. And for that, of course, it was very relevant to appoint a curator of ecology. So with Lucia Petroiusti, we are the first contemporary art organization to have a full-time curator of ecology, and with our teams working on these 50 campaigns. But this idea of healing is also very important. Healing that is something which you can see in the work of Emma Kunz, Healing the Planet. Emma Kunz is actually the first artist I encountered as a kid, because my mother would always buy this powder in pharmacies. You see, and you can still, whenever you're in Switzerland, you can go to a pharmacy and you can ask for ion, A-I-O-N. Because Emma Kunz in the 40s, she was a healer, and she discovered this rock, this stone, ion, which has healing qualities. And you can either drink it, or you can use it, you can apply it as a cream, or you can also, it's not only for humans, it's also great for plants. Plants, grow amazingly if you give it to trees or to your plants at home. And, it was, my mother always bought iron, so we always had it at home. And on iron, on the packaging, there was always one of these amazing drawings of Emma Kunz. So as a healer, as part of her healing practices, she would make these spiritual geometric drawings with which she wanted to heal the planet. And she was always thinking also on the impact they could have. There is one drawing, I don't have it here now, but she was thinking in the 40s, during the war, very hard, that when she made the drawing, and she would do these seances for many, many hours, and she was thinking very, very hard that if she would draw an entire night, maybe Hitler would die and the war would be over, you see. So she was always, it was very intense. And it's a little bit like Hilma af Klint, who is now very famous, the Swedish artist, whom we also showed at the Serpentine, who was last year at the Guggenheim. It's sort of spiritual abstraction, which doesn't come out of art. And so as part of this, we were very, very excited to organize a retrospective, because for me it was really how I got interested in art, because I kept asking my mother, what's this image on this, medicine? And then my mother once took me to see the Emma Kunz Centrum, and we saw the drawings, and then from there, I wanted to know more, and then I went to the Kunsthaus in Zurich, and I saw Giacometti, and I got obsessed by the long thin figures of Giacometti, and then I saw a show of Fischli Weiss, and then, it became, it's a bit like in the film of Fischli Weiss, which some of you might have seen, the way things go, it became this chain reaction. But the chain reaction of my life with art would never have happened without these drawings of Emma Kunz. And this whole idea of things disappearing, of extinction, as I mentioned, it's not only the extinction of species, it's also the extinction of cultural phenomena. And that, of course, brings us to my Instagram. A couple of years ago, first of all, I never knew what to do with social media. It was always a conundrum, no? It's very difficult with social media. Very difficult, how one should use it. And I knew that I didn't want to use it for self-promotion. I knew I didn't want to use it for, in a way to kind of document my life. I always wanted it to be more than that. I wanted it to be some form of movement. I wanted it also to be an exhibition, because as a teenager, I had a museum in my pocket, which was the Nano Museum, which is actually a museum. It's a little frame, which I bought in the shop of Hans-Peter Fellmann, the artist who used to have a shop. So it's a diptych, 2 by 3 inches, and I would always have it in my pocket. And then when I meet people in the street or in cafes or at university, I would show them my little frame, right? And so it was my portable museum. And then at a certain moment there was a drama because Douglas Gordon lost it, and Andreas Sominski brought it to a pawnbroker. So the museum the history got interrupted several times. We had to find a new frame. And it was somehow, when I got my first portable phone, and then the images arrived, the smartphones arrived, it always made me think of my portable museum, right? And so I was thinking one could maybe do with Instagram a portable exhibition. But it somehow didn't come together. And then one day I was with Ryan Trecartin, so like everything I do always has to do with artists, and Ryan downloaded the software of Instagram on my phone and then posted to all his many followers that I had joined Instagram. And so it was kind of a drama because suddenly there was this expectation. It's like, you're thrown into the water, but you can't swim. And so then I was thinking for many days and was somehow lost. And then, completely unrelated, and that's very often it's kind of how the methodology of how my projects come together. It's very non-linear, it embraces chance, it kind of follows an urgency, but there isn't a master plan. It's like going on a walk, right? And so then I was in Milano and I was speaking to Umberto Eco. And Umberto Eco, of course, was very much into books, as you know from his books. And his apartment was full of books. And then he took me to a secret room. And I suddenly got a bit scared because it made me think of the name of the rose, you know. And he had a key, a big key, and the door opened, and he locked the room behind. And he said, no one else can enter this room. This is, you know, it was a great privilege. He showed me his secret room of all the, you know, he had collected medieval books, handwritten books. And then he started to give me this lecture on calligraphy. And he basically said, you know, calligraphy is disappearing, and it's a big loss of humanity. And he said, your generation, you need to do something to avoid calligraphy. And he said, you should start the calligraphy school. So then, like, I was back on the train, you know, I went from Milan on a train to Zurich, and I was kind of thinking I'm not really the right person to do a calligraphy school, but because, you know, I'm not knowledgeable about it. But maybe I could find another way of bringing handwriting and doodling back. But I still didn't have the idea. And then, you know, a few weeks later, my partner Kushonga, the artist, and I were on vacation with Etel Adnan, the artist and poet, and her partner Simon Fatal, the artist and poet. And we basically went on a walk, and it was raining, and then we had to find shelter. We went to a coffee shop, and we spoke for hours. And, you know, as it goes, after a couple of hours, I would go on my phone, I would start to answer some emails. Simon did the same, Kut did the same. But Etel, who is 93, doesn't have a phone, a smartphone, so she took out her little notebook and started to write a poem. And in any case, I always think this amazing sentence is a motto, really, of what we need in our time. And Etel, you know, ever since Edouard passed away, Etel, over the last 10 years, has been my mentor. I go and see and visit her every month for wisdom. And she really gave me the idea for the Instagram, because I just saw her write this beautiful poem, and I took a picture, and I posted it on Instagram, and then I thought, like, wow, I could just every day when I meet artists ask them to write or doodle something. And of course, artists found all kinds of ways to answer to these questions. For example, Gustav Metzger invented a new handwriting, which he called the extinction handwriting. It became more and more illegible, all of us together. Then I went back to Echo and, of course, asked him to write something. Yoko Ono. So, you know, more and more it became also all these things, you know, and often it's of course connected to my conversation. I would record an interview, and then the artist, like here, this was the last conversation I had with the last Nobuo Sekine, and we talked about nothingness, and then, you know, he wrote it down. And then, of course, you have artists who have many post-its in my Instagram. You know, Heeman Chong, we worked together on Take Me, I'm Yours, on several exhibitions. So I've met Heeman many times. So there are at least 6 or 7 post-its of Heeman. So you can say, you know, it's a group show, but within this group show, you start to have small solo exhibitions. I mean, Etel, for example, I have 60 post-its. You know, we could almost do a book now of all the post-its of Etel, you know, in my Instagram. Here is Horuyan, also Po Zunyen. That was actually when the exhibition happened at the Haus der Kultur und der Welt, and I think it's the first time ever Ho Zunyen did a drawing, he told me. And then, of course, you know, artists also subvert the rule of the game, right? So sometimes it gets subverted. And that would have made Echo happy, right? Because Takesada Matsutani from Gutai actually did a calligraphy. And then with Genesis Breyer Piorich, you know, it goes into people inventing their own alphabet, inventing their own writing, right? Then it goes into drawing with Rachel Rose. Some artists use it to send the world an instruction. Of course, little by little, you know, my Instagram went beyond the art world. It became a little movement. And hopefully, you know, helps to somehow bring handwriting and doodling back. And of course, what also helps is that now more and more you have tablets with stylos, you see. And it's interesting that Steve Jobs was very much against stylos. And that, of course, had to do with the fact that he wanted the phone to be one object, right? And, you know, once you have a stylo, it becomes painful and difficult because you lose the stylo, and it's also a design problem. So, of course, you know, it didn't fit the very beautiful design. So that was the right decision from a design point of view, but unfortunately, handwriting and doodling suffered. But now with the tablets, I'm very optimistic that it's actually coming back, you know, more and more, also digitally. You know, it can be instructions, sometimes it's a motto, like Faith Ringgold, anyone can fly, all you got to do is try. Here, Jonas Mekas, he also, the late Jonas Mekas was a dear friend, so here we probably have also about 20 or 30 of his post-its. So that's also a solo show within the group show. Delpha Clemens. And then Henri Sala, you see, so many artist friends of mine don't want to do social media, so they use my social media as their social media. So I'm also, in that sense, it goes back to that Russian Matushka idea, you know. So Henri Sala, you know, has an Instagram in my Instagram. He sends me a clock every week. So that's Sala's clock, ticking. And then the exquisite corpse. Now, it's interesting because very often I would be with 2 or 3 artists in a cafe or in a meeting, or, you know, and we would somehow discuss the project, or we would have just have a random meeting. And so Ben Vickers at some point suggested that I should reactivate the old surrealist tradition of the exquisite corpse. The surrealists would always play this game. Breton was obsessed by it, where you would fold a paper into 2 or 3 parts, and then, you know, or 4 parts, and you would have a head, you would have a body, and then you would have, you know, you would unfold it, and it would always work. And so that was the first exquisite corpse we did with Alex Israel and Bret Easton Ellis, and there have been 189 so far. So that's also an exhibition within the exhibition. And of course, I also use Instagram as a book machine, because of course, little by little, you know, these projects will somehow become books. Then you have a whole history, you know, Michaud, surrealism, there's automatic writing, Barbara Chase Ribu. You have a whole series of also artists using it for drawing, here Kouchonga, a dog thinking of a dog. Or you have also, you know, again, instructions. It's like, do it, right? Carrie Mae Weems remembers us to dream. And then last but not least, we have, you know, it's urgent, but I'm going to talk about this next time, because that's a project which is just at its beginning. And I think it's kind of nice that we end with this idea of remember to dream. And I'm getting signs that we should stop, and I'm being reminded of my promise that this should not be a marathon. And in any case, I thank you all so much for being here, and I'm also very excited now to go on with my research here, because as I said, I'm always, you know, interviewing and having conversations with pioneering artists. So I'm very excited now to actually go on and make an interview and conversation with the visionary Tang Da Wu, whom I always wanted to visit. And I thank you all for being here. And Mr. Tang Da Wu is actually here, and we should give him a very big round of applause. So thank you all so much for being here, and have a nice evening. Thanks a lot.